The year 307 AD, especially in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, may have been the worst time and place to be a Christian in the history of Christianity. Perhaps even worse than the year 64, when the Roman Emperor Nero severed the heads of Christians, stuck them on poles, dipped them in kerosene, and lit them on fire, using the burning heads of Christians to light his imperial garden parties. 307 is even worse than the year 250, when the Roman Emperor Decius issued a universal decree requiring every person in the empire to perform a sacrifice to the Roman gods, and those who didn't faced immediate and intense imperial punishment. And let's just say, you'd be lucky if your sentence only involved torture. The result of Decius's decree was countless Christians were martyred in cold blood, including the Pope at the time, Pope Fabian. Clearly, these were not good times to be a Christian. But welcome to the year 307 AD, a time when Christianity was under the most brutal authoritarian attack and when hope seemed to be rotting away with every passing day. This is the story of the Great Persecution of Diocletian. The political atmosphere of Rome in the 3rd century was marred by civil war, starting in 235 AD when the Roman Emperor Alexander Severus was murdered by his own troops. This launched one of the darkest, bloodiest, and most unstable eras in Roman history, known by historians as the Crisis of the 3rd Century. In the following years, more than 20 emperors ruled in a 50-year span. Emperors during this period ruled for an average of just 3 years before being killed by their own soldiers or rival political opponents. To add to the chaos, Rome was constantly being invaded by outside civilizations. The Goths raided the Balkans and Asia Minor, and the Persians captured Emperor Valerian in 260. It was the first time in Roman history that a sitting emperor was taken prisoner. This was seen as the ultimate sign of weakness, causing pro-Roman propagandists to spread myths and legends that the Persians used Emperor Valerian as a human footstool until they grew tired of him, at which point they stripped him of his skin while still alive and then stuffed him and displayed his skin as a trophy. This story is probably not historically accurate, but it does reflect how Romans viewed their emperors. There was simply no room for weakness, and if you displayed weakness, your reputation would be tarnished forever. And just when you thought things couldn't possibly get worse, whole cities were sacked, trade routes collapsed, and Roman legions were stretched thin everywhere throughout the empire. Countless wars drained the treasury, which heavily devalued the currency, causing crushing inflation. Roman money became utterly useless, so much so that the local population reverted to bartering. Local officials were of no help due to extreme corruption, but how could you blame them? They were just as desperate as everyone else. And to add even more fuel to the flames, awful diseases like the plague of Cyprian ravaged the population for a good 13-year period. The Roman Empire was in complete anarchy. Nobody knew exactly how this chaos would end, but one thing is for sure. This extreme bout of misfortune only served to leave one question in everyone's mind. Why? Why was this happening? There must be a reason. Well, the empire's misfortunes came to be seen as a spiritual crisis just as much as a political one. Traditional Roman religion was built on the idea that following the conventional religious rituals properly would in turn cause the Roman gods and goddesses to impart divine blessings on the people. In other words, religious piety equaled imperial protection. Rome couldn't help but look at their awful state of affairs and conclude that something horribly spiritually wrong had been taking place within their midst. People began turning to mystery religions, astrology, magic, and new cults promising salvation. Anything really to attempt to pacify the angry gods. One particularly small but rapidly growing group of atheists started getting more and more imperial-wide fame, and not for a good reason. The group of atheists that I'm referring to were called Christians. And yes, you heard that correctly. Christians were seen as atheistic and unpatriotic because they refused to worship the traditional Roman gods, and they refused to worship the emperor as divine. Christians were viewed with much disfavor among the Roman elites and were even seen by some as the reason the gods were so angry. By the end of the 3rd century, Christians made up only around 5 to 10% of the Roman Empire. So they were still very much in the minority, but when you have an empire between 50 to 60 million, 5 to 10% equals out to be around 2.5 to 6 million Christians. Definitely not an insignificant number. So Rome, by the mid-3rd century, wasn't just politically unstable, it was spiritually terrified. By the year 284, one patriotic Roman elite sought to restore the mos maiorum, the ancient Roman way. This man was none other than the infamous Roman Emperor Diocletian. Diocletian would go on to attempt to wipe Christianity off the face of the earth. The reign of Diocletian officially ended the 50 years of chaos and brought the crisis of the 3rd century to a close. Diocletian was a career soldier from the Balkans. He was tough, capable, deeply superstitious, and completely obsessed with restoring Roman law and order. To do this, he reorganized the Roman government into something Rome had never seen before, and something that would ultimately be one of the most consequential decisions for the history of Christianity. He took the unprecedented action of dividing the Roman Empire into 2 sections, East and West, and instated not 2, but 4 rulers. This new form of government created by Diocletian in 293 is called the Tetrarchy. The Tetrarchy was organized as follows. Diocletian ruled as an Augustus, or senior emperor in the East, with his protege and son-in-law Galerius as Caesar, or junior emperor. Diocletian instated Maximian as the Augustus in the West, and Constantius Chlorus as Maximian's subordinate and trusted general as Caesar. The 2 Caesars, or junior emperors, were designated heirs to the Augusti, so if either Diocletian or Maximian were to die, their Caesars would take their place and designate new Caesars under them. In theory, this was a good idea. Diocletian believed this form of government would quell the endless civil wars that plagued so much of the 3rd century. The Tetrarchy decentralized power away from Rome. Rome was now symbolically sacred, but no longer the center of government. This change in government also created new provinces by splitting larger ones into smaller units. This multiplied taxation offices and military command outposts. Again, in theory, Diocletian's Tetrarchy wasn't a bad idea. Unity under the Tetrarchy would now be ideological, since power rested in the hands of 4 individuals instead of just 1. Roman propaganda of this period portrayed all 4 rulers as one harmonious entity, guided by the gods. They were even depicted as wearing the same armor. Diocletian believed wholeheartedly that he was restoring the ancient Roman way. Phase 1 was to reorganize the governmental structure of power. Phase 2 was to restore dedication to traditional Roman religion. Diocletian wrapped himself in divine imagery. He, as the Augustus in the East, was portrayed as Jupiter, and Maximian, the Augustus in the West, was portrayed as Hercules. Religion, during the reign of Diocletian, became fused with political identity and unity. Diocletian thought the culture of Rome, that which made Rome the greatest civilization in the history of the world, had been neglected. He would stand for it no longer. In order to better understand Diocletian and his religious edicts that terrorized Christians, we must first understand a few things about Roman religion. Starting under Octavian, who is more popularly known by his title Caesar Augustus, he enacted something called the imperial cult around the year 27 BC. The imperial cult under Octavian was essentially an organized way that the people of Rome could worship the divine spirit of the emperor. Augustus was very cautious about this. He didn't want to claim to be a god in real life because that was something more aligned with what you might find in a highly monarchical society, and during Octavian's reign, Rome was extremely against the idea of having a king. So Augustus, under the imperial cult, allowed the worship of his essence, which can be thought of as the divine spirit of the office. The imperial cult also allowed the worship of Rome and the emperor together, while recognizing that after death, the emperor ascended to the status of full deification. In other words, during life, the emperor had a spirit of divinity within, but wasn't yet divine. At death, the emperor would become a real divine being. The imperial cult can be described as a political religion, which coincided with the differing regional worship of the traditional Roman gods. Traditional Roman god and goddess worship wasn't anything like a modern-day religion today. There were no official canonized holy scriptures, no universal creeds, no liturgical methods of worship, and there wasn't even a list of gods and goddesses that must be worshipped. These things varied from region to region, and the religious flavor could change rather drastically depending upon when and where you were. So when I say traditional Roman religion, it must be understood that this wasn't a monolithic belief system, but that wasn't seen as a bad thing. In fact, these differing local flavors of religion were highly regarded, especially among the elites of society, considering they believed the state gods and goddesses influenced real events here on earth. The Romans didn't usually care what god or gods you prayed to or worshipped, as long as you asked them to bless the emperor and the empire as a whole. The key word here is usually. It didn't matter until it did. And as we will see, Christians would soon find out the horrible consequences of not worshiping the emperor. The imperial cult has a long, fascinating history which doesn't need to be fully examined here, but it is important to note that at first, with Octavian, and really whenever Rome was functioning well, the imperial cult was wildly successful. It unified the country and was comforting because people genuinely believed that the emperor was ruling under the guidance of his divine essence. But something interesting happens when Rome finds itself in shambles and when emperor turnover occurs every few years. The idea of a divine emperor becomes cheap. When everyone's a god, no one is. And what good is there in having a divine emperor when he is powerless to effectively govern his people? And what proof is there that an emperor has a divine spirit when he is murdered in cold blood by a political rival just a few years after achieving his high rank? Civil war tarnished the reputation of not only the status of the emperor, but of the entire imperial cult complex. When Diocletian came to power in 284, the old imperial cult was a hollow shell of its former self, devoid of any real value. So the challenge before Diocletian was this: how do you make people believe again? Not just in the emperor, but in Rome's sacred destiny. His conclusion was to rebuild the imperial cult from the ground up. To do this, Diocletian called himself Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. His regime would no longer be called the Principate as it was with Augustus. It was now called the Dominate. The emperor was no longer merely ruling for the gods, he was ruling as the instrument of the gods. Remember, Rome grew to hate kings, so the imperial cult was designed to walk the fine line between divinely inspired and full-blown divinity. Diocletian changed all of that. He began wearing jeweled robes and a crown, something that was considered un-Roman just a few years earlier. Access to him became strictly controlled. No one spoke directly to the emperor. You prostrated yourself before him. In other words, to approach the emperor was to approach the divine. Logically, it would follow that to disobey the emperor is to offend and disobey the gods themselves who ruled through him. This was the world Diocletian was in the midst of creating a reorganized governmental structure under the Tetrarchy, an intensified version of the imperial cult in the hopes of generating deeper respect and confidence in the Roman government, and a call back to worship the traditional gods of Rome. He preached a message of less tolerance for anything novel and anything that carried the scent of disloyalty and anti-patriotism. This, as you can probably imagine, is where Diocletian clashed with the Christians head on. They refused to worship the emperor or the empire, and they certainly didn't worship any of the traditional Roman gods. Many of them did say that they would pray to God for the well-being of the empire and the emperor, but in Diocletian's eyes, this simply wasn't good enough. Diocletian was a very superstitious man who is often cited as consulting oracles, soothsayers, and prophets. And whenever an oracle turned out to be false, he openly blamed the Christians for the reason they didn't work. Their lack of respect for the imperial cult and the traditional Roman gods caused the gods to send curses instead of blessings. Diocletian came to believe the main issue with Rome were these stubbornly hard-headed and rapidly growing groups of Christians. By Diocletian's day, Christians were becoming so numerous that ignoring them became virtually impossible. They were even serving in high ranks within Diocletian's palace guard. Pagan officials saw this as spiritual pollution of the empire's leadership. The straw that seems to have finally broken the camel's back came in the year 302 when a mysterious fire broke out in Diocletian's palace in Nicomedia. It could be happenstance if it happened only once, but it happened twice. Pagans close to Diocletian accused Christians of arson and sorcery. Diocletian became convinced the gods were angry, which only served to enrage him even more. Diocletian consulted his protege Galerius, who was his Caesar, serving under him. And believe it or not, Galerius was even more against the Christians than Diocletian was. Galerius demanded an empire-wide purge of all Christians and all things related to Christianity. It would be, in effect, a religious genocide. Diocletian hesitated at first due to the fear of civil unrest, but eventually he gave in to Galerius's demands. The era of the Great Persecution had just begun. On February 24, 303, Diocletian issued the first of what would become the 4 edicts of the Great Persecution. The first edict set into law that all Christian churches must be destroyed, all Christian scriptures must be burned, church valuables must be confiscated, and Christians must lose their legal rights. Loss of legal rights meant they could no longer bring lawsuits to court, they could no longer hold office, and those currently holding office must lose their rank and freedom. The second edict in the summer of 303 escalated things in a dramatic fashion. It set into law that all Christian clergy, including bishops, deacons, and even local parish priests, must be arrested if found. Those who were found and arrested were forced to sacrifice to the Roman gods under the threat of extreme torture. This gutted the church's leadership almost instantly. In Nicomedia alone, where Diocletian's residence was and where he spent most of his time, hundreds of church clergy were imprisoned. So much so that jails were filled to the brim, causing Diocletian to release common criminals to make room for the Christians. Jails essentially became a place for the most hardened villains and members of church leadership. The third edict came in late 303, which was partly an unexpected turn of fate and an attempt at mercy if the Christians complied. But if they didn't comply, this edict made things even worse than before. This edict promised amnesty for any imprisoned Christian who would sacrifice to the gods. But if they refused, the torture became even worse than before, and now execution was an option on the table. As awful as this situation now was, many Christians rose to the occasion and still refused to follow Roman orders. Those who held firm became known as the confessors, and those who gave in were known as the lapsi. This became such a common occurrence in early 4th century Christianity that it actually started to cause a divide within the church itself. Questions were raised among the hiding Christian groups as to what they should do with the lapsi. Some churches thought the lapsi denied Christ and were therefore not strong enough in their faith to remain connected to the church. Many churches simply excommunicated the lapsi, causing them to start churches of their own for those who still believed, but that fear overtook them when their lives were on the line. Other churches weren't so strict and allowed both confessors and lapsi to partake in their community. So by the end of the year 303, not only were Christians being hunted down by the most powerful people in the Roman Empire, their churches were fighting one another, causing a massive self-inflicted divide. Christianity was splintering, and it started looking like it was on its last legs. How could any organization, religion, or cult survive something like this? The only hope in sight, the only way they could see a way out of this mess, would be if a new political revolution caused the overthrow of the entire tetrarchy. But the Great Persecution was not yet finished, and the final edict was yet to come. In early 304, the fourth edict was made law of the land. It was the nuclear option. It required every person in the empire, man, woman, and child, to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods in a public ceremony on the threat of being killed on the spot. This edict wasn't just directed at Christians. It was an empire-wide purge of all that wasn't Roman through and through. What followed depended upon region and the emperor in charge. In the east, with Diocletian and Galerius, the persecution was absolutely brutal. And perhaps worst of all, it wasn't short-lived. It was a long, sustained, and systemic persecution with no end in sight. Bishops were horribly tortured before being executed. In Palestine, Eusebius of Caesarea, the famous 4th century church historian, recorded that Christians were burned alive, torn apart by wild beasts, publicly mutilated, and drowned. It got so bad in Egypt that this period actually has a name in the Coptic church tradition. They call this era the era of the martyrs, which would go on to become the name and start of their dating system, Anno Martyrum. In Syria and Asia Minor, entire congregations were executed or sold into slavery. Eusebius tells us that Christians were subject to having their eyes gouged out, their tendons severed, being roasted over iron spits, torn apart on racks, or even having molten lead poured directly into their open wounds. With all of this torment and pain, how could things get any worse? Well, they do. In the next 2 years, from 305 to 307, the Christians' only hope that Diocletian would die and a new government would step in and reverse their misfortunes, this hope, their last hope, would die right in front of their eyes. Things were looking positive in late 304 AD because Diocletian's health began to fail. The hope was that his death would cause a shift in the power structures of the empire and cause an empire-wide revolution that would change the fortunes of Christians forever. And this is actually ultimately what happened, but not in 304. To the shock of everyone, in 305, the Emperor Diocletian did something that had never been done in the history of Rome up to that point. He resigned. He moved Galerius into his position as the Augustus of the Eastern Empire, who, as you might recall, hated the Christians even more than Diocletian did. Galerius was a fanatically traditionalist pagan who had one goal when he became Augustus: to completely eradicate the Christian religion from the face of the earth. Under Diocletian, the persecution of Christians were legalistic and a matter of government policy. But under Galerius, it became personal, with systemic hunting, torture, and public execution being the standard. Armed forces were tasked with the sole purpose of going Christian hunting. Galerius reissued the edicts and even expanded them, forcing all provincial governors to hunt and root out all Christians. And this time, not just clergy, all of them. Men, women, children, babies, anyone connected to a church in any capacity was to be hunted and destroyed. Torture became the main weapon of compliance for all, and if you can believe it, the torture became even worse. Now, as part of the torment, families were forced to watch each other's punishments. Children were forced to watch their parents be skinned alive or burned slowly or even publicly stripped and beaten. Those who refused to watch were decapitated or burned alive on the spot. Some accounts suggest some cities saw hundreds of public tortures every day. In 305, when Galerius became the Augustus, he appointed his nephew Maximinus as Caesar. Maximinus was conditioned to hate the Christians just as much as Galerius. There was literally no end to the Great Persecution in sight. Maximinus ordered certificates of sacrifice for every citizen to verify that they had worshipped the gods. He created a network of local religious police to check compliance. He encouraged local communities of average Roman citizens to organize these ad hoc mob militias to hunt Christians down and violently attack them. By 307, the state of Christianity was in complete shambles, only made worse by the fact that pretty much all of Rome was also in shambles. But Galerius' campaign began backfiring. The economy tanked, manpower drained due to being relentlessly occupied by executions, and civil unrest reached its peak. Pagan priests claimed that the Roman gods were still mad despite all the Christian blood being spilled, and entire provinces were demoralized. This, in 307, was officially the worst place and worst time to ever be a Christian. 307 was only 4 years into the Great Persecution, which lasted until 311. But something absolutely shocking happened in 307 also. It certainly shocked Galerius, but it also shocked Roman citizens so much that they became obsessed with the Christian cause. Despite it being the worst conceivable environment for Christianity, it started to grow. In 307, arguably the worst phase of the Great Persecution, the bravery of many Christians being willing to endure suffering, torture, and death created a conversion boom in the underground churches of the Eastern Empire. Martyrs were seen as heroes of the faith. Pagans began converting to Christianity in record numbers. Christianity was gaining new followers faster than Rome could kill them. Galerius' plan to exterminate the Christian religion literally backfired. He poured fuel on the flames instead. He helped Christianity while hurting himself. The Eastern Empire fell apart, and his popularity rating was at an all-time low. Now, according to our best source on this phase of history, which comes to us from the ancient church historian Lactantius, he states that Galerius was struck with a horrific and humiliating disease. He describes it as a deep ulcer in the lower part of the body, eating into his very bowels, breeding worms, and emitting an insufferable stench. Galerius was in such agony that toward the end of his life, he begged the Christians, those who he had once hunted, to pray for him. It was in this desperate state that he finally admitted defeat and issued the Edict of Tolerance in 311 AD, officially ending the era of the Great Persecution. Christianity had survived its most challenging trial in history. What happened next must have been absolutely inconceivable just a few years prior. In 312, Constantine rose to prominence and won the Battle of the Milvian Bridge on October 28, 312 AD. And in February of 313, the Edict of Milan was issued by Constantine in the west and Licinius in the east that officially granted full religious freedom to everyone. It ordered that Christian property in churches be returned, and it recognized Christianity as a legitimate religion within the empire. The history of the Great Persecution shows that diamonds are made in times of extreme pressure, and that faith is one of the most powerful forces in this world, and that it can overcome just about anything. Hey, if you dig this type of content and want to learn all about what happened next, I made a video all about Constantine, the Edict of Milan, and the Council of Nicaea, which can be seen as a kind of sequel to this video. You can check it out right here. Oh, and you can hit that subscribe button too if you want to make sure that you never miss an upload. As always, thanks for watching.